By the government will not problem the judgment to produce abuser John Worboys, the Judiciary Registrar says. David Gawkey told it would not be relevant to search a court overview of the password executive boards governing to complementary Worboys following less than rather than 10-year. Victims as the Mayoress of London are searching a court overview. The password executive board has told it is sure proper procedures were accompanied. Worboys, 60, was concluded in 2009 for assaults on 12 female in London. Mr. Gawkey told Down there would be a broad overview of how the password executive board deals in victims. The government had been examining the opportunity of a legislative problem to Worboys's produce, but the Judiciary Registrar told how, following advising lawyers, it would not be relevant for him to begin. He told, I aware the will frustrate the victims in the instance and members of the building taking into account the crimes for that he has been condemned. On a private standard, frankly I stake such concerns. He added his judgment should not halt other of manufacturing their own legislative problem. Allow me be completely precise, Worboys will not be liberated before his victims' representations include been correctly deliberate and his license facility are in location. At his test, the trial heard how Worboys gave his victims narcotic-laced sparkling wine, pretending he was celebration a big raffle gain. The ex-dark cab motorist was taking into account an indefinite verdict of detention, in a minimal period of 8 years, for social protect. Prosecutorial trust Worboys, who modified his behalf by act survey to John Radford, may include transferred out more than rather than 100 sex assaults and rapes on female in London among 2002 and 2008. Victims groups and representatives were offended by the news story of Worboys's inevitable produce over the monthly proverb lot were not aware of it was done social. They told, in an email to the password executive board on January 16, he remnant a risk to female and how all should be made to halt his inevitable produce. They are crowdfunding their activity and include acquired more than rather than £25,000. Attorney Richard Secretary, of the company Roofer and Gordon that provided 11 victims in civilian cases versus Worboys, told his clients were frustrated at by the government's judgment, but would go striker in the sacrifice court overview. It is key how the judgment to produce the manipulation, prudent and hazardous man can be deliberate by the courts as quickly as probable. Dark Judiciary Registrar Richard Bugan named for an freelance overview of the instance, proverb it grown lot severe questions and calling by the government to recover social trust in our judiciary framework. Labour's London Mayoress Sadiq Khan told he would search a individual court overview. Addition, I am deep worried and unfortunate on the perspective of John Worboys's imminent produce. At the really low his victims and Londoners requirement the password executive board's judgment to be correctly scrutinised by the courts. I will do all I can to provide the happens. But ex-imprisonment Secretary Crispin Ruff told Mr. Gawkey had fairly resisted the seduction to do a Narodnik item that would include been profligate of taxpayers' cash, as a legislative problem of by the government would include had no sensible perspective of successful. The password executive board told it welcomed the overview in how it deals in victims. We believe the is a reasonable year of activity to get to do certainly how the social and particularly victims include trust in the password executive board's job. A court overview is wherever a magistrate reviews the legality of a judgment done by a social flesh, in the instance, the password executive board. It is less than on if the judgment was law or incorrect, and more than on stimulating if appropriate procedures were accompanied to achieve the judgment. In Worboys's listening, the Payne deliberate a file of 363 pages, surveyed Worboys oneself, heard testimony of 4 persons psychologists and jail and probation's personnel and were taking into account a spelled declaration of one of his victims. The definitive judgment is relying on next hazard, not if the unique verdict was relevant, Mr. Hardwick told. In the instance, Mr. Gawkey told he had 2 perspectives outdoor to him to procedure such a overview, how a judgment was one how no executive board could sensibly include undertaken, or how down there were considerable remedial failings in the way how judgment was undertaken. His judgment not to go front suggests he couldn't show each, says QC and legislative columnist Joshua Rosenberg. As Mr. Gawkey told in his declaration, the bar for a overview to prosper is really top, and it is unparalleled for a registrar of country to give a court overview. As Judiciary Registrar, Mr. Gawkey can ever counsel Parliament to changing the rules by that the password Executive Board plant. He's extraordinary for victims to problem password Executive Board decisions as, unsurprisingly, largest disputes are on prisoners' creature rejected produce. A attorney operating on name of two female who say they were sexually assaulted by Worboys has told they will give their own overview on two perspectives: how the password Executive Board rules are illegal in how they hinder the publishing of reasons for decisions, and the judgment to produce Worboys in lighting of facts nearby his crime and accountable of his development in jail appears to be completely unreasonable. On the at first land, David Gawkey has named on a broad overview of the password Executive Board that is potential to lead the other land will be hard to show out of the publishing of the detailed information of the listening. Mr. Rosenberg told he struggles to see how the victims would include a superior opportunity of successful rather than Mr. Gawkey. Court reviews are hard and fairly as, he added. We don't aware why the Judiciary Registrar neglected a offered court overview, but taking into account the password Executive Board is sponsored by his ministry, he's quite difficult to see how he could problem its mine openings if personnel in jail backed the produced judgment. Court reviews are hard to gain. A applicant must show how the social flesh acted unlawfully or took a judgment how was so unreasonable or corrupt how no else would go to the identical finding. The capacity court overview of Worboys's victims is potential to claim how the password Executive Board's rules are illicit, since down there is a precise social concern in demonstration the open secret reasons for the produced judgment, but as well how everything such reasons were, they must include been unreasonable taking into account all how is named on the series offensive. Time the password Executive Board is a nearly trial, arguments are put and judgments are done, its processes are completely individual. Victims and the social can sit in and hear. Indifference, any of us can go to trial and listen the comprehensive arguments introduced to a magistrate decisive if or not to prison a penal.